Imagine a slave market at the Forum Boarium in Rome. The auctioneer shouts, "Greek boy, 12 years old, can read and write. Starting bid, 1,500 denarii. Who's going higher?" Chalk on his feet marks him as newly arrived. Next to him stands a worn-out Thracian farmhand going for just 500. On the platform, a young Syrian woman, her beauty alone priced at 6,000. So how did the Romans put a price on a human life? What affected those prices, and how do these amounts compare to modern money? Let's break it down. Slave markets were the beating heart of Rome's slave trade. People were bought and sold as casually as we buy a new phone today. And just like us, the Romans loved paperwork. Every sale came with a contract, receipts for the money, and written proof of delivery, not of goods, but of people. Because of that, we now have a window into the brutal everyday reality of slavery in the Roman world. Slavery was part of Roman life from the city's beginning to the fall of the Western Empire. Naturally, prices changed over time, rising and falling with wars, the economy, and shifts in society. In this video, we're focusing on a specific stretch of time, from the 1st century BC to the 2nd century AD. Why this period? Because it's simply the one we know the most about. Take the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, a massive collection of all known Latin inscriptions. It spans 17 volumes, and 16 of them come from the imperial period. The same goes for literature. About 90% of surviving Roman texts were written during this era. Even famous authors from the Republic like Cicero, Caesar, and Lucretius were active in its final years. Altogether, over 90% of our sources on ancient Rome come from just the last 40% of its history. So it's no surprise that this is the period most historians rely on. But it's not just about having more records. This was also the peak of Roman slavery. After Caesar's campaigns, the markets were flooded with hundreds of thousands of captives, and at the same time, the Roman economy was still relatively stable. That's what sets this period apart from later centuries, which saw rising inflation and a collapsing currency. It's during this window that we get the clearest picture of how the Roman slave market really worked, with consistent prices, clear standards, and a fully developed system. Put simply, this 250-year stretch is ideal for study. It gives us a wealth of sources and a fully developed slave market to examine. So what determined whether a slave was priced at 500 or 5,000 denarii? The Romans approached this with cold, calculated logic. They valued people the way they value livestock. The first thing that affected a slave's price was their origin. Romans held strong, often stereotypical views about different ethnic groups. Greeks, for example, were seen as cultured, educated, and intelligent. They were also thought to be less likely to run away or rebel, which made them highly sought after. Greek slaves were typically used for household duties, childcare, or as personal assistants and secretaries. Gauls and Germans were valued for their physical strength and toughness, which made them ideal for gladiator training. Gauls had a reputation for being rebellious, while Germans were seen as loyal to their masters. They were often bought specifically for hard labor, farming, construction, mining, or even as personal bodyguards, especially if they had gladiatorial experience. Slaves from the East were viewed differently. Syrians, Phoenicians, and Judeans were considered skilled in crafts, moneylending, and trade. They were often thought of as clever and shrewd in business. Because of that, they were frequently purchased to manage estates or oversee profitable businesses on behalf of their owners. Slaves from newly conquered territories were usually cheaper, but that changed as those regions became more Romanized. Once the locals started speaking Latin, learned to read and write, and adopted Roman customs, their market value went up. Another major factor was skill and education. Unskilled laborers were at the bottom of this price range, while slaves with valuable trades, literacy, or a classical education, especially those fluent in Latin and other languages, were worth much more. A basic slave with no special talents might just go for a few hundred denarii, but a skilled craftsman could fetch 10 times that. Pliny the Younger mentions a shoemaker who was sold for 4,000 denarii. For comparison, a regular legionary at the time earned about 20 denarii a month. Intellectual professions were valued even higher. There are accounts of a Greek grammarian being sold for 10,000 denarii and a doctor for 20,000, about the cost of a small house in Rome. The poet Martial writes about a cook who specialized in exotic recipes. He sold for a jaw-dropping 100,000 denarii, the price of a full country estate. And a talented Greek actor named Panurgus reportedly sold for an astonishing 700,000 denarii. Slaves like that weren't just hired help, they were status symbols, bought to show off wealth, sophistication, and taste. The third major factor was age. Slaves between 15 and 25 were the most expensive, old enough to work hard, young enough to last for decades. Children were more of a gamble. Infants and toddlers were often sold cheaply, sometimes even given away for free with their mothers, since there was no guarantee that they would survive. But once a child reached around 10, their price started to rise. Romans saw them as a good investment, young, easy to train, and already capable of helping out. Wealthy families would sometimes buy children to raise alongside their own as companions for their sons and daughters. These vernae, or homeborn slaves, were especially prized for their loyalty. After 25, a slave's value began to decline. By the age of 40, they might be worth only half of what they would have fetched in their prime. After 50, a slave was considered old and only valuable if they had specialized skills. Many elderly slaves were simply freed, not out of kindness, but to avoid the cost of feeding and housing them. If they were sold at all, it was often for a token amount. We even have records of 60-year-old slaves being sold for as little as 100 denarii, or less. That said, there were exceptions. An experienced doctor or teacher could still bring in a decent price thanks to their knowledge. A trusted estate manager who knew all the inner workings of a household could remain useful well into old age. But for most slaves, getting older meant simply becoming invisible, and expendable at that. A slave's physical traits were another major factor in their price. For laborers, strength was everything. A tough, physically fit worker who could handle farm work or construction was far more valuable than a slim, delicate youth with no experience in manual labor. At auctions, slave traders would often make slaves lift or carry heavy stones to show off their strength and endurance. Any visible defect, a limp, a deformity, or a chronic illness, could significantly lower their price. But when it came to household slaves, the standards were completely different. Beauty took center stage, especially for young boys and girls. Light skin and hair, symmetrical facial features, and graceful hands were all highly prized. Slaves with potential were often fattened up, groomed, and given cosmetic treatments before being sold to make them look as attractive as possible. An exotic appearance, like dark skin, could also increase a slave's value. Some wealthy Romans even curated their entire households to match a specific look. All blondes from Britain, or all dark-skinned Ethiopians, for example. The inspection process at the market was deeply invasive and humiliating. Buyers would examine teeth, muscles, and skin for any marks or scars. Slaves were often forced to jump, run, or perform physical tasks on the spot. In theory, sellers were required to disclose any illnesses or physical defects, but in practice, they often went to great lengths to cover these up. The fifth major factor was gender, and it essentially created two very different markets. Male slaves were far more common than females. Healthy adult men were seen as the most versatile labor force, always in demand and with steady prices. Their value came down to a few practical questions. Could he work? How hard? And for how long? Women, on the other hand, were judged by a broader and more complicated set of criteria. While they did plenty of work in the home, the kitchen, or in textile workshops, their price was also shaped by things like youth, beauty, and virginity. These qualities could dramatically increase their value, sometimes far beyond their actual labor potential. A young, attractive woman might go for 6,000 denarii, while a man the same age might sell for only 2,000. Reproductive ability also added another layer to this. Women who could have children, future slaves, were considered a smart long-term investment, since children born to enslaved women are automatically enslaved. Women of childbearing age were especially valuable on large estates that planned for the future. Some roles specific to women came with extra price tags. Wet nurses, for example, were expensive. Many wealthy Roman women refused to breastfeed themselves, thinking it beneath them. A healthy wet nurse could sell for 3,000 denarii or more. Midwives were even more valuable, as were women trained in cosmetics, hairstyling, and skincare. Then there was sexual attractiveness, a factor that often influenced the price of young girls and boys. In many cases, they were valued less for their ability to work and more for their potential use in sexual exploitation. These traits were sometimes openly listed in sale descriptions and could drive prices as high as those for elite craftsmen. Slave prices in Rome were also shaped by market forces. Just like today, supply and demand played a major role, but the swings could be much more dramatic. The biggest factor was war. After successful campaigns, Roman legions would return with thousands of captives, flooding the markets and driving prices down. After Pompey's eastern campaigns, there were so many new slaves that traders actually complained about losing profits. It's estimated that nearly 1 million slaves entered the market after Caesar's Gallic Wars alone. During long periods of peace, prices went up. By the 2nd century AD, as Rome's borders stabilized and military conquests slowed, the steady flow of war captives dried up. The slave market began to rely more on breeding within the empire and trading with tribes outside its borders. Location mattered as well. Rome had the highest prices. It was a prestigious market with wealthy buyers and constant demand. A slave who might sell for 2,000 denarii in the capital could go for just 800 in a frontier town. Egyptian papyri showed even lower prices, partly because Egypt had its own trade routes linked to Nubia and the Red Sea. Seasonal demand also played a role. Farm workers were most expensive just before the harvest, when labor was in high demand. After the harvest, the same slaves might sell for a third less. Experienced traders took advantage of these cycles, buying in the winter when demand dropped and reselling in the spring before planting season. To get a better sense of how the Romans priced their slaves, let's take a look at a few example cases. For example, a man from Gaul, 22 years old, strong and physically fit, experienced in farm work, but missing 2 fingers on his right hand. Or, for example, an older Greek man, 55 years old, he's fluent in both Greek and Latin, well-versed in philosophy and rhetoric, and has years of teaching experience. On the downside, his age is a significant drawback. Another lot is a boy from Numidia, just 11 years old, healthy and quick to learn with an exotic appearance, but no particular skills. Next for sale is a beautiful Syrian girl, 17 years old, striking features and fair skin, trained in dancing and singing, skilled cook, speaks Greek, and comes from a region known for capable household workers. Another example is a strong Thracian man, 28 years old, well-built and with combat experience, trained in gladiator school, but has old wounds and visible facial scars. The final lot is a changed Germanic man, 25 years old, strong and durable, ideal for hard labor. However, he's branded with the letter F on his forehead, meaning fugitive. He tried to run away from his previous master. Now, how do you convert ancient Roman prices into modern terms? Honestly, it's not easy, and there is no single right answer for this. One of the simplest methods is to look at the silver content of the coin and compare it to today's silver prices. A denarius contained about 4.5 grams of silver, which would make it worth around $6 today. Straightforward, sure, but that doesn't really tell us much about what the coin would actually buy back then. Another way is to compare the prices of everyday items, things like bread, meat, or eggs, and just see how far a denarius went compared to modern money. For example, graffiti in Pompeii shows that 1 denarius could buy about 4 kilos of pork, or roughly 2.5 kilos of beef or lamb. A whole chicken cost 2 denarii. Based on that, the spending power of a denarius might be somewhere in the range of $20 to $25. You could also look at wages. Under Augustus, a Roman legionary earned about 225 denarii a year. Today, a U.S. soldier makes roughly $46,000 annually, which would put the value of a single denarius at around $200. Another comparison is grain. A bushel of wheat today costs around $6. In early imperial Rome, a bushel went for about 2 to 4 denarii. By that logic, one denarius would be worth between $1.50 and $3. As you can see, the numbers are all over the place. Depending on the method, you can get anywhere from $2 to $170 for a single denarius. That's because the Roman economy was completely different from ours. None of these comparisons tell the whole story. For example, looking at wheat prices then and now misses the point. Modern farming uses machines, fertilizers, and high-yield crops. Roman farming relied on manual labor, oxen, and rain. The time and effort involved, and the value of the overall product, were totally different. That's why in this video, we're not going to try to convert Roman prices directly into dollars. Instead, we'll show you what you could actually buy with a certain amount of money, because that's the only way to really understand what 500 denarii meant in the world of ancient Rome. To put things into context, let's take a look at what wages and prices looked like in ancient Rome. As we mentioned earlier, a legionary during the reign of Augustus earned about 225 denarii a year. By the end of the 1st century, that had gone up to around 900. A basic tunic would cost you anywhere from 15 to 30 denarii. Renting an apartment in a Roman insula, one of those multi-story apartment buildings, could cost between 40 and 100 denarii a year, depending on the neighborhood. A large house outside of the city would set you back anywhere from 5,000 to 20,000 denarii, prices we know from property records found in Pompeii. Now let's compare that to slave prices. An average male slave with no special skills went for about 1,000 denarii, just a little more than a year's salary for a legionary. That kind of money could also buy you a small shop in the suburbs of Rome. A skilled slave trained in a trade might cost around 3,000 denarii. A legionary would have to serve for 3.5 years just to afford one. An attractive young woman priced at 6,000 denarii. That's nearly 7 years of a soldier's pay. For the same amount, you can buy a modest villa outside of the city. A slave physician could sell for 20,000 denarii, the price of a luxurious estate. These numbers are staggering, but behind each one was a real person, a child ripped from their family, a craftsman forced to serve a new master, a woman sold into a brothel. The slave market was cold, calculated, and brutally efficient, and it never stopped. It adapted, expanded, and lasted for over 1,000 years. Prices changed, trends shifted, but the core reality stayed the same. In ancient Rome, people were bought and sold, counted in coins, and listed as property in household records. Once again, if you've made it to the end of this video, we really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. We have a whole team behind this, and we really love seeing you follow along on our journey through ancient civilizations. We put out new content every single week. If you'd like to support the channel and help us make more videos like this, consider joining us on Patreon. You'll get early access to new episodes, work in progress updates, and more. Every bit of support goes a really long way. Thank you. You can also leave a super thanks down below if you'd like to give us a little extra boost. It really means a lot and helps us keep going. We hope to see you next time.